Welcome back to Susanne Kurz Coaching. Death and Beyond, number 3. I want to continue the story of how I came to this place where I am now, where I am completely convinced that death is not the end and that our consciousness can exist independent from our bodies, outside of our bodies, and hence can live on after death. That's my current conviction, and here's the next part of the journey, how I got there. Last time I told you that in my early 20s I dropped reading a book about near-death experiences because I found that it didn't do me any good and I had to focus on my current life at this stage. And that was mainly because the near-death experiences and the reports about that weren't as consoling for me as they could have been, because people who have come back to tell such stories obviously have been reanimated or in some other way come back to life, have not been completely dead. So one could argue, it's a legitimate argument to say they haven't been dead. So what they are reporting is not about death, but it's about something you experience maybe right before death. That is something that also scientists have taken as a fundament for arguing that these people have been close to death and there's a chemical cocktail and a chemical firework going off in your brain in such situations, and that produces such perceptions, and it's basically it's a sort of hallucinations. That was something that I had in mind, and that didn't let me believe this as a proof for life after death. So therefore, I dropped it for a while and I put it into the background. I knew I hadn't resolved it, but for the time being, I was okay focusing on other things because I was still very young. And this went pretty well for about 10 years until my last grandmother died. So the last grandparent who was still alive at that time. And that came as a brutal shock for me and was a really, really shattering experience. Despite the fact that she was very old, but at this point I hadn't expected her death. It was a surprise for me, so it was a shock. And on top of that, we had a really close relationship. And that's not only because she was there for the longest amount of time, because I was an adult, I was in my early 30s when she died, but also because we had an actual lively relationship, the most lively relationship of all my grandparents I had with this grandmother. I liked to talk with her. She was very open and very interested, and even as a young person, that was nice for me. That was fun to me, and I actually asked her about things, about experiences she had had, and I always profited from that, from her stories and her experiences and her worldview. So it was a shock, and it was a shattering event. Actually, I have been there. I was the last one to arrive at the hospital, and the others had told her that I was on my way, and she waited for me and then opened her eyes again, and so we could communicate with looks. I did talk to her, but she couldn't talk, but she looked at me, and she knew I was there, and then she let go and she died while I was there. And although that really helped me, I was still very, very shattered and desperate and really against this death. I wasn't at peace with this death. I was resisting it. It wasn't okay for me. It just wasn't okay for me that my grandmother had died at this point in this way. And when we were clearing out her apartment and were sorting her things, and she had kept some little presents from us, some that we had made for her when we were children, and some later ones. So she had kept some presents as a souvenir because it meant something to her. And each of us was given these gifts that we had made her, we were given them back. So we had to take our gifts to her back. And that was a really horrible moment for me, because it really felt like this wonderful person, my grandmother, with all her love for us, had just vanished into nothingness. She had dissolved. She wasn't there anymore. She just didn't exist anymore. And her feelings for us didn't exist anymore. And everything that was special about her didn't exist anymore. And my love for her didn't have a point anymore to focus on, didn't have a place to go. It just went off into nothingness as well. Just so. And that was a really horrible feeling. It took me 4 years until I got to the point where I could make my inner peace with it and actually accept her death. And that's because, well, I had basically put it into the background again, as before, because my life was there was a lot going on at that point. I had just handed in my PhD dissertation. I then had to look for another job because the contract was running out, and we had a big apartment movement coming up. So there was a lot going on and new beginnings and all that. And so it was relatively easy to put that into the background again and override it with focusing on the now. But then 4 years later, it came back to me. Mainly because I was gliding into a major midlife crisis, because I wanted to have children. And at that point, it was becoming clear that that might not happen for various reasons. And I was really unhappy with that. And I was wondering what it's all about. I mean, what sense does it make at all if I'm to live and die and vanish into nothingness without a trace? I've been here, but in a few generations nobody will remember that. There's not even my genes going on, you know. That was a major crisis. I thought about the meaning of life and what sense does it all make. Anyway, what are we here for? I restarted to read about near-death experiences and about other phenomena. And also I started to read books where science is explained for dummies, like myself, like physics and brain research and things like that, just to see what are the arguments, what are the clues, the hints, the descriptions and so on, to start to make up my mind. And what I found there and what conclusions I've drawn and why I've drawn them, I want to start to tell you in the next video, because it gets too long otherwise. So come back here. I hope to see you again, and have a nice time.